Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into some pretty mysterious conditions. We're talking about equine grass sickness and other animal dysautonomias.
Multiple system neuropathies.
Exactly. And they affect a whole range of animals.
Horses.
Cats, dogs.
Llamas, alpacas.
The list goes on. And the strange thing is, for the longest time, no one knew what caused them. It's been a real enigma.
It really is a puzzle.
Like take equine grass sickness, or EGS, for example. It's a devastating disease. Kills roughly 1% of horses grazing in high-risk areas.
That's a significant number. And the lack of a clear cause has made prevention and treatment really tough.
Absolutely. And that's what makes some new research so interesting. It suggests that a neurotoxic phospholipase A2, PLA2, could be the culprit behind these dysautonomias.
That's right. PLA2s are enzymes. You find them all over in nature, but some of them have this really sinister ability to disrupt the nervous system. Think of them as tiny saboteurs wreaking havoc on nerve cells.
So we're talking about a potential toxin. That's somehow targeting the nervous systems of these animals.
That's the working theory, There was a recent study published in the Equine Veterinary Journal, and they found some pretty compelling evidence. They discovered significant abnormalities in the skeletal neuromuscular junctions.
The NMJs.
Yep, the NMJs. These are those crucial points where nerve cells communicate with muscle fibers.
Got it. So what kind of abnormalities are we talking about here?
They found what's called synaptic vesicle depletion. So this means the nerves are basically running low on the chemical messengers they need to communicate. The neurotransmitters.
Interesting.
They also saw degeneration of the nerve terminals themselves, which is a sign of some serious damage.
So it sounds like those abnormalities point to a very specific type of damage, one that's consistent with a neurotoxic PLA2.
Yes, and that's what makes this research so compelling. The changes they observed in the NMJs really resemble the damage seen in animals envenomed by snakes with PLA2 toxin.
So we're talking about a toxin that acts similarly to snake venom, but obviously these horses aren't being bitten by snakes.
Right.
So where could this toxin be coming from?
That is the burning question, isn't it? One possibility is that these horses are ingesting microbial PLA2s. Maybe from plants or the soil. There's also a theory that the PLA2s are being produced within the horse's own gut by their microbiome. We know that gut dysbiosis, an imbalance in the gut's microbial community, is linked to EGS. So that's definitely a strong contender.
And of course, we can't rule out plant PLA2s themselves. Plants produce these enzymes naturally, and their activity actually increases when the plant's under stress.
Exactly. Factors like drought, injury, or infection can all trigger plants to ramp up their PLA2 production as a defense mechanism.
Fascinating.
So it's entirely possible the plants themselves could be contributing to the problem, particularly if they're growing in tough conditions.
It's amazing how this research is revealing potential connections between the environment, the horse's gut, and this neurotoxic PLA2. But how does this toxin actually get from, say, a blade of grass to the horse's nervous system and cause such severe effects?
Well, it's a journey, and scientists are still piecing together the exact route. But the leading hypothesis is that the toxin, whether ingested or produced in the gut, is absorbed into the bloodstream. From there, it circulates throughout the body. Now, the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, has a really effective barrier, the blood-brain barrier.
Right.
That filters out many harmful substances.
It's like a security checkpoint.
Exactly. However, the peripheral nervous system, which includes those NMJs we talked about, the autonomic ganglia that control those involuntary functions, and the enteric nerves in the gut, it doesn't have the same level of protection.
So it's like these areas are more vulnerable, more susceptible to attack by something like a neurotoxic PLA2.
That's right.
And once the toxin gets access to the peripheral nervous system, it can start to wreak havoc on that delicate communication network, the one that controls so many vital functions.
This is where things get really interesting, right? Because now we're talking about the molecular level, like how this PLA2 toxin is actually disrupting the nerve's ability to function.
Absolutely. So neurotoxic PLA2s essentially hijack the nerve's communication system. They trigger uncontrolled release of neurotransmitters, which initially overstimulates the nerve.
Right.
But this overload eventually leads to nerve terminal damage, like burning out a circuit by overloading it.
Okay, so we have this uncontrolled firing of the nerves, depletion of those vital synaptic vesicles we talked about, and ultimately the destruction of the nerve terminal itself.
Right.
It's starting to paint a pretty clear picture of why these horses experience such severe symptoms. But there was a detail mentioned in the study about omega-shaped invaginations in the nerve membranes. What are those and why are they significant? Ah, yes. The omega-shaped invaginations. These are really fascinating structures observed in the presynaptic membranes of affected horses. They're like fingerprints left behind by the PLA2s, indicating that a crucial process called endocytosis has been disrupted. Endocytosis is basically the process of recycling those synaptic vesicles, those little packages of neurotransmitters.
So not only are the nerves firing uncontrollably, but they're also unable to replenish their supply of neurotransmitters.
Exactly.
That explains why the damage is so severe and why these horses struggle with those basic functions, like swallowing and movement.
It's a double whammy for the nervous system, and these findings really shed light on just how insidious these neurotoxic PLA2s can be.
And the plot thickens, because there are other effects of PLA2s that might explain some of the more puzzling features of EGS, like the disassembly of the Golgi apparatus and the accumulation of snare proteins.
Okay.
Can you remind our listeners what those are?
Of course. The Golgi apparatus is like the cell's packaging and shipping center. It processes and sorts proteins and lipids, getting them ready to be transported to their destinations, either within the cell or outside of it. Snare proteins are essentially the couriers that help transport these packages.
So are you suggesting that the PLA2 is disrupting these essential processes too? It sounds like we're talking about a system-wide breakdown within the nerve cells.
That's exactly what the evidence suggests. This disruption of the Golgi apparatus and the accumulation of snare proteins point to a broader cellular dysfunction, a sort of domino effect triggered by that PLA2 toxin.
This all ties back to a fascinating study done back in 1973 by a researcher named Gilmore.
Yeah.
He found a transmissible neurotoxin in the blood of horses with EGS that actually induced similar neuropathology in healthy horses.
Oh, wow.
Could this transmissible toxin Gilmore discovered be a PLA2?
That's a very tantalizing possibility. It definitely warrants further investigation. But for now, the focus is on definitively identifying the specific neurotoxic PLA2 involved in EGS and pinpointing its source, because that's the key to developing those effective prevention and treatment strategies.
And those strategies are desperately needed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen how devastating this disease can be.
Absolutely. If we can identify the source, we can develop strategies to minimize exposure. It could be as simple as changing grazing management practices to reduce contact with potentially toxic plants or soil. Or it could involve developing a vaccine to protect horses from the toxin.
And maybe even targeted treatments. I mean, if we know what we're dealing with, we could potentially neutralize the toxin itself or mitigate its effects, right?
That's the crux of the matter. And there is some hope on the horizon. Interestingly, research into snake venom PLA2s has actually opened up some potential therapeutic avenues.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, early administration of antivenom has shown some promise in preventing the neurotoxic effects of snake venom PLA2s. Of course, this would depend on identifying the specific PLA2 involved in EGS and developing an appropriate antivenom. Yeah. It's not a quick fix, but it's a possibility worth exploring.
Absolutely. But what about treatments for horses that are already showing symptoms of EGS? Is there any hope for them?
That's where things get trickier. Once the damage is done, reversing it is a much bigger challenge. But even there, snake venom research offers a glimmer of hope. Studies have shown that even though snake venom PLA2s cause significant nerve terminal damage, the postsynaptic membrane, the receiving end of the signal, remains surprisingly intact. And this is crucial because it seems to trigger a regenerative process.
So even though the nerve terminal is damaged, there's still potential for the nerve to regrow and reconnect.
Exactly. And research has identified a key player in this regeneration process, the melatonin receptor 1, or MT1. It appears that activating this receptor can promote nerve regeneration and functional recovery.
Wow. So are we talking about melatonin supplements for horses with EGS?
Not exactly. While melatonin itself has some antioxidant properties, researchers are focusing on specific MT1 receptor agonists, like ramelteon and agomelatine. These drugs have shown significant potential in promoting nerve regeneration in mice after paralysis induced by PLA2s.
So potentially, these drugs could help horses with EGS regain nerve function and recover from the debilitating effects of the toxin.
That's the hope. Of course, more research is needed to determine the efficacy and safety of these treatments in horses, but it's a promising avenue, and it really highlights the interconnectedness of scientific research. Who would have thought that studying snake venom could hold the key to treating a devastating disease in horses?
It's remarkable, isn't it? And it underscores the importance of supporting research into these often overlooked animal diseases. Who knows what other secrets they hold that could benefit both animals and humans?
It's a question that researchers are really actively pursuing right now. And there are some promising leads emerging. One area of focus is on a specific type of PLA2, known as secreted phospholipase A2 group IIE, or SPLA2IE. And this particular PLA2 has been found to be elevated in the blood of horses with EGS.
Oh, interesting. So we're narrowing down the suspects, so to speak.
Exactly. And what's really intriguing about CPLA2IE is that it's also found in the mammalian gut, which ties back to that potential gut connection we discussed earlier.
Right, that possibility of the toxin originating from the horse's own microbiome or from something they've ingested.
Precisely. Now, another piece of the puzzle researchers are exploring is the role of inflammation in EGS and other dysautonomias. Remember how we talked about neuroinflammation being a common factor in both animal dysautonomias and human neurodegenerative diseases?
Yes, I remember you mentioning that.
Well, it turns out that PLA2s are really potent pro-inflammatory mediators. They can activate a whole cascade of inflammatory responses, leading to even further damage in the nervous system.
So it's not just the direct toxic effects of PLA2s that are contributing to the problem. It's also this inflammatory response they trigger.
That's right. It's like a vicious cycle, with the PLA2s fueling the fire of inflammation, which in turn exacerbates the damage to nerve cells.
That makes sense. And this inflammatory response could explain why the symptoms of EGS are often so widespread and affect multiple systems.
Yeah, inflammation can spread throughout the body, affecting all sorts of organs and tissues. This could explain why horses with EGS experience not only neurological symptoms, but also gastrointestinal issues, cardiovascular problems, and even changes in their immune function.
It's starting to sound like EGS and these other dysautonomias are incredibly complex conditions, with multiple factors all playing a role.
They certainly are. It's not a simple case of a single toxin causing a single problem. It's a whole web of interconnected pathways, with genetics, environmental factors, the gut microbiome, and the immune system all potentially contributing to the disease process.
It's a real challenge for researchers to untangle all those threads.
Absolutely. But despite the complexity, researchers are making progress. And with each new discovery, we're getting closer to understanding those root causes of these really devastating diseases and developing some effective treatments.
Speaking of treatments, we touched on some potential therapies inspired by snake venom research. Are there any other avenues being explored?
Yeah, there are several other approaches being investigated. One promising area involves targeting those MT1 receptors we talked about earlier. Remember how activating these receptors can promote nerve regeneration?
Yes, that was really fascinating.
Well, researchers are exploring the use of drugs that specifically activate MT1 receptors, hoping to stimulate that nerve repair in horses with EGS and other dysautonomias.
So it's like giving the nervous system a boost, helping it to heal itself.
Exactly. Another approach involves targeting that inflammatory response. Researchers are looking into the use of anti-inflammatory drugs to try to dampen that inflammatory cascade triggered by PLA2s.
That seems logical. If we can control the inflammation, we might be able to prevent further damage and give the nervous system a chance to recover.
Precisely. And there's another really intriguing avenue of research that's focused on the gut microbiome. Remember how we talked about the possibility of gut-derived PLA2s or alterations in the gut microbiome contributing to EGS?
Yes, that was one of the initial suspects, wasn't it?
Well, researchers are exploring ways to modulate the gut microbiome to try to restore a healthy balance and potentially reduce the production of PLA2s or other pro-inflammatory factors.
So are we talking about probiotics or dietary interventions?
Those are definitely possibilities. Researchers are also investigating fecal microbiota transplantation, which involves transferring healthy gut bacteria from a donor animal to a recipient animal with EGS.
Wow, that's a pretty radical approach. But it makes sense if we're thinking about the gut as a potential source of the problem.
Exactly. It's a way to try to repopulate the gut with those beneficial bacteria and reestablish that healthy microbial ecosystem.
It's incredible to see how research is progressing on so many different fronts. But while scientists continue to piece together this puzzle, what can horse owners and veterinarians do in the meantime to protect their horses from EGS?
That's a really important question. While there's no guaranteed way to prevent EGS, there are some management practices that might help to reduce the risk. One key factor is grazing management.
Okay, so we're back to the pasture.
Right. Some studies have suggested that horses grazing on pastures with a high clover content might be at increased risk of EGS. So minimizing clover in the pasture might be beneficial.
Interesting. What about other dietary factors?
Well, there's some evidence suggesting that feeding horses a really high-quality diet with adequate vitamins and minerals might help to support their immune system and their overall health,
Okay.
potentially making them less susceptible to EGS.
So it's about providing them with the best possible nutrition to give them a fighting chance.
Exactly. Another factor to consider is stress reduction. Remember how we talked about stress in plants increasing PLA2 activity? Well, stress in horses can also have a negative impact on their immune system and gut health, potentially making them more vulnerable to EGS.
So it's not just about the physical environment, but also the emotional well-being of the horse.
That's right. Minimizing stress through good management practices, providing adequate space, social interaction, and a consistent routine can all contribute to a horse's overall health and resilience.
These are all practical tips that horse owners can implement. But early detection is also crucial, right? What are some of the early signs of EGS that horse owners and veterinarians should be aware of?
Absolutely. Early detection is key because the sooner treatment is initiated, the better the chances of recovery. Some of the early signs of EGS can be quite subtle and easily overlooked.
So what should we be looking for?
One of the earliest and most consistent signs is a change in demeanor. Horses with EGS often become withdrawn, depressed, and less interested in their surroundings.
That's a pretty general sign, though. Couldn't that be a symptom of many different conditions?
You're right, it's not specific to EGS, but it's a red flag that something is amiss and warrants further investigation. Another early sign is a loss of appetite. Horses with EGS may start to eat less or refuse food altogether.
Okay, so changes in behavior and appetite are definitely something to keep an eye on. What about more specific neurological signs?
Those usually develop a little later, but it's important to be aware of them. Horses with EGS may start to show signs of dysphagia or difficulty swallowing. They may drool excessively, cough, or choke when they're trying to eat or drink.
That sounds pretty alarming.
It is, and it's a sign that those nerves controlling swallowing are being affected. Other neurological signs to watch for include muscle tremors, weakness, ataxia, or incoordination.
So stumbling, tripping, or difficulty walking.
Exactly. These signs indicate that the nerves controlling movement and balance are being compromised.
This has been an incredibly insightful discussion so far. It's clear that EGS and these other dysautonomias are complex and challenging conditions, but there's hope on the horizon. Researchers are making significant strides in understanding the underlying mechanisms and exploring those potential therapies. In the meantime, horse owners and veterinarians can play a crucial role in protecting horses by implementing good management practices, minimizing stress, and being vigilant for early signs of the disease.
I completely agree. And I think it's important to emphasize that research in this area is ongoing, and we can expect to see even more breakthroughs in the coming years. It's a really exciting time to be involved in this field.
I'm excited to see where this research leads and what new discoveries are on the horizon. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more fascinating aspect of this story. Remember how you mentioned the potential connection between animal dysautonomias and human neurodegenerative diseases?
Yes, that's a connection that has researchers particularly intrigued.
Well, there's one human disease in particular that seems to have some striking similarities to EGS. It's called acute pandysautonomia.
Ah, yes, acute pandysautonomia. It's a rare but severe neurological disorder that affects the autonomic nervous system, which, as you recall, controls those involuntary bodily functions like heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and temperature regulation.
Exactly. And the symptoms of acute pandysautonomia sound eerily similar to what we see in horses with EGS.
That's right. Patients with acute pandysautonomia often experience symptoms like orthostatic hypotension, which is a sudden drop in blood pressure when standing up, abnormal heart rate, gastrointestinal problems, urinary retention, and even difficulty swallowing.
Wow, those are virtually identical to some of the key symptoms of EGS.
It's a really remarkable parallel, and what's even more intriguing is that acute pandysautonomia is thought to be an autoimmune disorder, meaning that the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own nervous system.
So could there be an autoimmune component to EGS as well?
That's a question researchers are actively exploring. There's some evidence to suggest that EGS might involve an abnormal immune response, potentially triggered by an environmental factor like a toxin or a pathogen.
So it's possible that in both EGS and acute pandysautonomia, something is causing the immune system to go haywire and attack the nervous system.
That's a working hypothesis. And if it proves to be true, it could open up entirely new avenues for treatment, potentially involving immunomodulatory therapies to suppress that overactive immune response.
This connection to acute dysautonomia adds yet another layer of complexity to the EGS puzzle. But it also highlights the potential for groundbreaking discoveries that could benefit both animals and humans.
I completely agree. By studying these seemingly disparate diseases together, we might unlock crucial insights into those fundamental mechanisms of neurodegeneration and pave the way for some novel treatments.
It's a testament to the interconnectedness of all living things and the power of scientific inquiry to transcend those species boundaries. It really is amazing to think about how much we've learned about EGS and other animal dysautonomias, really just in recent years. But obviously, there's still so much we don't know.
That's science, right? You answer one question and it opens up a dozen more.
Totally.
Yeah.
It just makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, totally.
And I think this deep dive has really emphasized how important it is to think holistically about these complex diseases.
I agree. We can't just be looking at the toxin or the pathogen. We really need to consider the interplay of genetics, the environment, the gut microbiome, the immune system, even the horse's mental and emotional states, like a whole system approach.
Yeah. It's a perspective that can really inform how we approach EGS, but also our understanding of human neurodegenerative diseases too.
Absolutely.
The more we learn about how these seemingly different conditions are connected, the more opportunities we have to develop really effective treatments and prevention strategies.
Absolutely. And while researchers are trying to figure all this out, there's a lot that horse owners and vets can do right now.
That's a great point. We've talked about good management practices, minimizing stress, being on the lookout for those early signs of illness. All of that is so crucial.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key. Work closely with your vet. If you notice any changes in your horse, don't hesitate to reach out for help.
I couldn't agree more. So, to recap for our listeners, we've been talking about equine grass sickness and other animal dysautonomias. And we explored the evidence pointing to neurotoxic PLA2s as a potential cause, looked at where these toxins might be coming from, and discussed the roles of the gut microbiome and the immune system in all of this.
We also talked about those interesting parallels between animal dysautonomias and human neurodegenerative diseases, like Parkinson's disease and acute pandysautonomia, and how what we learn from one could really help us understand the other.
It's been a really mind-blowing journey, and while researchers are still looking for a cure, we've definitely gained a better understanding of these really complicated diseases, and hopefully new therapies are on the way.
I think this is just the beginning of a whole new chapter in understanding neurodegenerative diseases, and as the research keeps advancing, I'm sure we'll unlock even more secrets and find new ways to protect both animals and humans from these conditions.
It's really exciting to think about, and I want to leave our listeners with this thought. As you watch those beautiful horses grazing in the pasture, remember that they could hold the key to solving mysteries that could benefit all of us. The answers might be closer than we think, just hidden within the amazing world of nature.
From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.